Hello, and welcome to another Cyber Threat Alliance webinar. My name is Neil Jenkins, and I'm the Chief Analytic Officer at CTA. We're a nonprofit organization that brings cybersecurity providers together to share information and collaborate on the latest cybersecurity threats. There's obviously a lot of other cyber activity that we could talk about today with Ukraine activity, but we thank you for joining us. We're going to instead take a look back at 2021. Joining me today from CTA member Cisco is David Liebenberg. Dave is the head of strategic analysis at Cisco Talos, and he's a member of CTA's Algorithm and Intelligence Committee. And most importantly for today, he pulls together data and trends from the Cisco Talos Incident Response team. Today, Dave's going to walk us through their incident response findings from calendar year 2021. So before we start, just a bit of logistics. Viewers can ask questions in the Q&A window of the webinar. We'll do our best to incorporate any questions into the discussion. If we can't get to them, we'll try to reply to you later. So let's get right to it. Dave, why don't you get started?
All right. Thanks, Neil. So yes, today we'll be covering incident response trends for last year, 2021. So this report is going to cover basically the top threats we've seen, as well as trends in the attack lifecycle and security weaknesses that could have facilitated some of the attacks we've seen. We'll take a look at some of the major security incidents that occurred that affect IR's caseload. And we'll have some prognostications for what we think we'll be seeing in IR in 2022 as well. Right off the bat, I'll get started with targeting. So healthcare was the top targeted vertical for most of 2021. 3 out of the 4 quarters, healthcare was the top targeted, the exception being Q3 in the fall, in which was local government, but even then healthcare was a close second. And this is a trend that actually goes back to even 2020, where the last 2 quarters of 2020, healthcare was also the top target. And if you look at that time-wise, it pretty much overlaps a lot with the pandemic, which certainly made things worse for healthcare organizations.
And Dave, on that healthcare organizations piece, is that mainly hospitals, or would it also include like biopharmaceutical companies that may have seen some espionage attempts related to COVID-19 research and that kind of thing?
So it did include some research organizations, but most of the exfiltration we saw was actually directed more towards hospitals and involved exfiltrating personally identifiable information, or PII. But, you know, as we always like to remind people, just because you don't see exfiltration or staging occur doesn't mean necessarily that it didn't occur due to the evasive tactics that some of these actors can take.
Great, thanks.
Okay. So now I'll cover some of the top threats that we observed. So by a mile, ransomware, the top threat, just has been completely dominant for a long, long time. And if you look at this chart, it's pretty striking. With the exception of Q1, every quarter besides that, ransomware took up nearly 50% of all the threats that we saw in IRs, excluding false positives. And this just speaks to, you know, how much enterprises need to be concerned about ransomware as a threat.
And Dave, have you guys seen anything like this in the past where a single threat type was so dominant throughout the year?
So it's interesting. Ever since we started compiling these reports, you know, in the very beginning, you'd see ransomware up high, but you'd also see some of the tools that were used in ransomware alongside it as much, like commodity malware, for instance, a lot of trick bot stuff like that. But as the quarters went on, it just became ransomware, ransomware, ransomware. And essentially every single quarter, except for Q1 of 2021, when the caseload was pretty much exploded by the Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities, and that took up a lot of IR's attention, you've pretty much just had ransomware dominate the entire time. Again, just speaking to the utter prevalence of this threat. So let's dig a little bit more into ransomware as a threat. So beginning in 2020, and then in the first half of 2021, a lot of these IRs, ransomware IRs, are dominated by one family, which is Ryuk. But an interesting, so that culminates in Q2 of 2021 when you have Ryuk and Revil tied as the top most observed variants. But that same quarter, we see a shift happening, because that same quarter, we also identify 13 other ransomware families. And this is the beginning of a greater democratization. After that quarter, Ryuk is gone. We don't see it anymore. And instead, we see a bunch of new families come in and sort of take its place in a way. A variety of different families emerge. Some of this is due to groups disbanding and then rebanding in some different amalgamated way. Ryuk becomes Conti, Doppelpaymer to Grief, Dark Side to Black Matter, et cetera, et cetera. So beyond the democratization of these groups, one of the other major trends we're seeing is a shift in tools used for initial access. As I sort of hinted at in the beginning, originally we're seeing a lot of commodity Trojans used for not only initial access, but for lateral movement and a lot of different other capabilities in the attack lifecycle. But all of a sudden we start seeing a lot of new tools. Cobalt Strike being one that we've been observing a lot more frequently this year. We also see, applications being used in ways that, they typically wouldn't. GMER is an application that detects and removes rootkits, but we've observed an uptick in 2021 of actors using it to disable security and logging software. Similarly, we see a lot of use of living off the land binaries or LOLBins. And these are tools that are usually native to the victim's machine, like PowerShell is kind of the prototypical example that's frequently leveraged. But also remote access tools such as TeamViewer and stuff like that being used for malicious activities as well. And finally, an interesting trend we saw was a lot of use of new vulnerabilities by ransomware actors somewhat shortly after disclosure. So by Society, we saw using Print Nightmare, Ryuk using Zero Logon, and stuff like that, incorporating these vulnerabilities into their attack lifecycle, making their attacks more successful.
Yeah, thanks. I just really want to, emphasize the point you made about the diversity in ransomware, that, by the end of the year, you saw a different ransomware in every case you did in that last quarter. That's amazing. It's stunning to me. What advice do you have for organizations trying to deal with that kind of diversity in this thread? Is there common threads that they can look for across these various threats?
So, I mean, it's difficult, right? Because even when it was one family per se, you have a lot of different affiliates who are using different tactics. So even with one dominant family, you can still see a diversification in the types of attacks and the types of tooling they'll use. There's more advanced affiliates. There's affiliates who, are much sloppier. So really, the way to approach a greater diversification of groups is just to maintain the same, cybersecurity hygiene and tips that you can use to, prevent most ransomware attacks, offline backups, having IR plans in place, instituting MFA, extremely important, email security, things like that. I think the general approach to defense should not change given the diversity of groups.
And it's a good reminder too, that it's not just the ransomware variants that are important. It's also the variation, the actual affiliates that are implementing that's important as well.
Yes.
And one other point on this slide that I want to ask about, how quickly are you beginning to see ransomware actors leverage new vulnerabilities? What's the turnaround time on that looking like?
So the quickest you'll ever see are crypto miners, because they truly do not care. They just have the worst tradecraft possible. As soon as a PSU is released, they are dumping it out modding out, whatever test C2 was in the POC with their own. So they're the first ones you see. And then shortly thereafter, you'll see the more advanced groups, your APTs or your ransomware groups incorporated. So for Vice Society, for instance, that was about a month after Print Nightmare was initially disclosed that we observed them leveraging that technique, and pretty similar for Ryuk with zero logon. So it's not like lightning quick, like you'll see with crypto miners. They'll usually take some time to strategize it, figure out how to put it in their tool set. But it is still relatively quick.
Great, thanks.
So in terms of other threats we observed, BEC, business email compromise, was the other big one. In Q3, we actually observed the most business email compromise cases we'd ever seen in a single quarter. Talos did a great deep dive on BEC, by the way, which I recommend everyone check out. It remains a huge threat to enterprises in addition to ransomware. Actions after compromise that we saw included sending out additional phishing messages externally and internally, which of course are going to look more legitimate because they're coming from a trusted organization. We also saw posting credentials on the dark web and even orchestrating fraudulent wire charges. Solar marker was a threat that Talos has been tracking for a while. My colleague Andrew Windsor has been doing great work on tracking solar marker. They're a modular .NET info stealer and keylogger, and we've seen them in quite a few attacks recently or in 2021. Cryptocurrency miners, as I just mentioned, they're just evergreen. Who knows if they'll ever go away, but like I said, anytime a new vulnerability is released, you're going to see floods of cryptocurrency, botnets trying to target that vulnerability. Then Redline Info Stealer, that emerged in 2020, and we saw an uptick of cases using Redline in 2021. Typically, adversaries in these cases were using it to scrape credentials from the browser cache.
Great, and I just want to clarify, is Solar Marker related to SolarWinds at all?
It is not, except for the Solar moniker. SolarWinds, APT, supply chain attack. Solar markers, more what we consider an average persistent threat. Like they're definitely persistent, but they're not going to do supply chain compromise. It's going to be mostly, drive-by downloads or something like that. Different targeting as well.
Great, and thank you for now introducing a new APT, average persistent threat. I have to figure out how to.
I think I saw that on Twitter, so I don't want to.
We'll credit you for it if you like.
So now let's get into some trends in the attack lifecycle. First, in terms of initial access, I want to clarify that because of logging deficiencies, oftentimes we can't pinpoint the exact means of initial access, and we'll have to make reasonable assumptions. But in the cases where we could pinpoint it or make those assumptions, two big ones stood out: email and exploitation of public-facing applications. For exploitation, that number is really driven by the Microsoft Exchange 0 days. Like I said, that exploded, took up a huge number of our IR casework. And we also saw additional targeting as well, like targeting virtual infrastructure software, like Citrix virtual desktop infrastructure, stuff like that. Email is the other big one, and that's no surprise. If you have ransomware, that's a really typical means of initial access, is a phishing message from a ransomware actor with a maldoc in it. And then email, of course, with the large number of business email compromise, with us, having one of the quarters where we saw it the most, email is going to play a huge part there, obviously, as well. Kind of a funny note is that starting in 2021 and even carrying into this year, there have been an uptick of malicious USBs used as a means of initial access, which is a true blast from the past. As a coworker said, hooray for job security. But just a reminder that even these old, outdated attack vectors can still be used and still have success.
That blew me away when I saw that in the report. So Is that coming from organizations kind of getting lax about old threats and forgetting that as part of a potential attack against their threat surface?
I think that's definitely possible. I mean, this is an old vector, so maybe organizations aren't stressing training this as much anymore. There's also certain industry verticals, like those employing OT, that may, have USB reuse problems or stuff like that. But it's really hard to say. But we just want to remind people: do not put any strange USBs in your machine. We also had an incident where someone had a USB that they brought from home, and it might have been got infected that way and put it in their work network machine. So again, highlight some of the dangers that hybrid work or bring your own device can have, and just please stress USB hygiene. It's so important.
Absolutely. Don't plug it in if you find it in the parking lot. Give
Right.
it to a security person.
Or if it's mailed to you, just don't do it.
Absolutely.
So in terms of lateral movements, compromised accounts were pretty much the top tactic we observed. You can, whether they compromise the accounts themselves or, some other group compromised them and they purchased them on the dark web. Compromised credentials were something we saw very frequently. We also saw a lot of PS exec used to move and stage ransomware executables. And RDP, again, another top way for people to move around, whether it's through compromised credentials or brute forcing or what have you. But RDP remains quite popular, with an uptick in, I believe, Q3 and Q4 of observing RDP for that reason. Reaching out to C2s, what we really have been seeing a lot is Cobalt Strike being used for this purpose. And this in general ties down to a lot of, the consistent rise in Cobalt Strike that we've seen in ransomware and other engagements beginning in 2020 and maintaining all throughout 2021. Cobalt Strike can be used for a number of different things, but we have definitely observed it being used for C2 purposes as well. In terms of persistence, it's really, a lot of the same old stuff that people are generally aware of: scheduled tasks, cron tabs alterations, leveraging stolen credentials, web shells, modifying registry keys, and also lots of remote access tools, like I mentioned earlier, such as AnyDesk or TeamViewer and stuff like that. In terms of exfiltration, what we see a lot is actors either downloading or using on the victim's machine compression tools like 7-zip to compress what they want to exfiltrate, and then using services like Megasync to upload it to a public hosting provider. And for evasion, one of the top tactics we've seen is using PowerShell to clear event logs like scheduled tasks and file drops. We also see, the actor come in on a machine that doesn't have any EDR or any endpoint detection in place, and from there pivot to other systems that do, and disabling that EDR. Modifications to Windows Defender settings, and also seen quite a bit of time stomping or timestamp manipulation as well.
So, one question on the remote access tools that you mentioned, things like AnyDesk and TeamViewer. Are you seeing actors? I mean, that's legitimate software, right? Like, it has a legitimate use. Are you seeing actors install that onto machines, or are you seeing them leverage that software that was already put there in place?
Most typically, we've seen actors downloading it themselves. And that's a lot easier, because then IR can reach out and be like, hey, is this, are you supposed to have this on machine? If it is on the victim's machine, it becomes a lot more difficult to parse out, was this being used maliciously or not, and then you can go by, does this account typically use it, and things like that. But typically we see the actors downloading it.
Okay, great. And then the exfiltration that you mentioned, is most of that in relation to your ransomware cases where you're seeing the double extortion techniques?
Definitely, a lot of it is. A lot of it is tied to that double extortion. For instance, we saw Cerber ransomware and Entropy ransomware using Mega NZ, Hive ransomware group exfiltration to actor-controlled C2. So definitely a majority of it was. Sometimes we'll see screenshots on the leak sites, and there's times where we're not able to forensically confirm that actually took place, which again emphasizes just because, forensically you're not able to identify it doesn't necessarily mean that the exfiltration didn't take place.
Great, thanks.
So we've always had similar advice to organizations. And to be clear, all this stuff is very important. Patching, inventory, segmentation, training, having an incident response plan. But we have made some shifts in our messaging a little bit in terms of what we want to underscore as the number one thing one of the number one things we'd like you to do. Earlier in the year, we were stressing email security and phishing awareness, given how much ransomware incidents were coming in through email and the amount of business email compromise. And as the year went on, we started emphasizing more and more the importance of instituting MFA. And we identified that a lack of MFA is probably one of the biggest hindrances to enterprise security. There is a large number of ransomware incidents that could have been avoided with MFA. So we absolutely encourage, wherever possible, when you can, and especially on sensitive systems, to institute MFA as soon as possible.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah. All right. So now I'd like to talk about some of the major security incidents that occurred in 2021 and how they sort of influenced IR's caseload. So first, SolarWinds. Everybody remembers that. That was actually late 2020, but carried in, of course, into early 2021. It's a supply chain attack, which adversaries gained access to victims' networks via Trojanized updates of SolarWinds. This attack targeted numerous enterprises and US government organizations. IR engaged in several IRs related to this, which they had unknowingly downloaded that Trojanized update. But very few of these engagements involved post-compromise activity like malicious PowerShell execution with PowerUp that had been seen in other places. The big one for us, of course, as I mentioned several times in this prezo, is Microsoft Exchange 0 days. This blew up IR caseload. We saw a ton of these. In fact, in Q1, it comprised 35% of the incidents. As opposed to SolarWinds, which is much more direct targeting, Microsoft 0 Day Exchange come out indiscriminately targeted from tons of actors, crypto miners and APTs and everybody. And we're still this is just to illustrate that these things can have a longer shelf life sometimes than you think, is that we're continuing to see these Exchange 0 day vulnerabilities. In the winter, we've had several that involved, abusing Microsoft Exchange. So that is still going on. In July, we had Revil have an attack against Kaseya, which provides IT solutions to managed service providers. They reached around 1,500 organizations through this. Again, limited number of engagements and very few that involved post-compromise activity. Here's the big one. You see the burning log right there. So Log4j, December of 2021, the tail end of the year. We had Log4j come out, a critical remote execution vulnerability. There were minimal Log4j CTIR engagements that involved post-compromise or adversary activity from that. But we're continuing to remain vigilant after that. And in our telemetry, we're also seeing, Log4j continuing to be exploited. to drop a variety of different payloads, cryptocurrency miners, Dridex, Cobalt Strike, etc. And as I'll talk a little bit on the next slide, Log4j could have long-lasting implications. And then there were the incidents that occurred that didn't, directly affect IR caseload, but were still affected them indirectly through how they changed the threat landscape. And here I'm talking about Colonial Pipeline attack, most of all, which creates, all sorts of waves in the ransomware community. So even though that isn't a directly involvement in that, the sort of waves that created have definitely, affected things in late 2021 and beyond in this year.
Absolutely. And yeah, this was clearly a huge year in terms of major incidents. So how did this end up affecting your incident responders? Were they just exhausted, or did the teams have to make some tough decisions about how and where to respond to incidents?
Definitely led to exhaustion, and IR especially, and all of us, they do it right around holiday breaks, so it's just like, oh my goodness. Yeah. Lots and lots of exhaustion, and it does lead to some tough choices. Retainer customers are already always going to get taken care of, but beyond that, when there's a huge flux like Microsoft Exchange, you have to prioritize, those kinds of customers. So it's always important to get an IR plan in place before something happens and not during. Have all your ducks in a row so you're prepared for when the shoe drops.
Absolutely. Yeah, great point there on the incident response planning, and always a good point to remember to take a break when you can, because you never know when you're going to be in the middle of something like a Microsoft Exchange.
Exactly. And enjoy downtime when you have it.
Absolutely.
So finally, I just want to go over some of the what we think might be happening going forward. So Log4j, we are already seeing threat actors in IR and in our telemetry exploiting Log4j in vulnerable VMware Horizon servers, dropping Cobalt Strike, miners, and other payloads. So that just illustrates that even, following initial disclosure of a major event, if it, seems a little quiet at first, like there are still threat actors, particularly advanced threat actors, who may look to target those vulnerabilities in the future. Supply chain.
Sorry, Dave, one thing on Log4j.
Yeah.
What are your expectations on this? Some of the things I've read and heard is that there may be something about this vulnerability that makes it a little more difficult to exploit at scale, at least compared to what we originally thought. Is that something you all are thinking about? Is there anything fundamentally about Log4j that makes it a little bit harder to exploit?
It's definitely something we're continuing to look at, right? Because it's such a strange case. It blew up. Everyone has it. It's incredibly hard to patch for because you don't know where it is or how to take care of it all the time. But you don't see like the explosion that you saw with Microsoft Exchange 0 days. So I think depending how it's used, it might be more difficult to exploit, maybe with some timely mitigation or remediation work. It's hard to tell, but I think the real serious actors, your APT groups and really well-funded ransomware developers and affiliates, will continue to find ways to use it on a smaller scale, even if difficulties and exploitation don't lead it to a scale of mass kind of attacks like we saw with Microsoft Exchange.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please get out there and patch, do everything you can to mitigate. But yeah, at least we've got maybe a little bit of breathing room, maybe. But thanks.
Yeah, supply chain, if supply chain taught threat actors anything, it's that it's a fantastic and great way to do things. It's likely going to continue. And the interesting thing is it's not just used by your APT actors anymore. What Kaseya really opened people's eyes to is that these well-funded ransomware groups can do supply chain attacks too. So you might see more advanced groups, not necessarily, state actors or things like that, engage in these types of attacks. These actors are going to try and turn trusted relationships against you, as they always have. And it's just a great way to get a huge bucket of targets and pivot to the high value ones you really want. Emotet, we're continuing to watch out for. Our managed services have seen a lot of Emotet, haven't seen a ton of it in IR, not as much, but we're still looking for, as Emotet comes back, what's that going to look like? What's the Emotet to ransomware pipeline going to look like? Something we're continuing to watch out for. And here's the big one. US government ransomware initiatives, which is basically after Colonial Pipeline, as I sort of alluded to earlier, things changed a lot. There is a lot more scrutiny on groups now from international and occasionally domestic law enforcement. So you saw CISA release a report maybe last week or a little bit earlier that they're looking at 2021. They saw a lot of ransomware actors transition from big game hunting in the earlier part of the year to focusing on smaller targets, possibly to avoid detection, avoid that scrutiny. So, with that, you see some select arrests. You see a lot of drama and infighting on the dark web forums. My colleague Azim Kojibayev has been doing a lot of great work tracking on that. So you might see more splintering of groups. You might see some groups have better operational security. You might see some more difficulties for open source researchers as certain forums are closed down or restrict more access. But I think there's still going to be groups that, decide they want to target critical infrastructure. We had reports that Blackbite ransomware had targeted critical infrastructure. So you kind of see an attack life cycle where, will always be some big affiliate or big group that's ready to just stir the pot, even though other ones have been kind of hampered by that activity.
Yeah, it's really exciting to see, what the U.S. government is doing on some of these ransomware initiatives and monitor what changes are happening. I definitely think that they've had some impact. The arrests in Russia have definitely had some impact on the thinking there as well. Definitely isn't going away, but at least there's something is changing. Do you think that these kind of continued attacks against smaller targets are going to continue in 2022, and they'll try and stay away from some of the more high-end critical infrastructure?
I think that's certainly possible. We are in a very influx geopolitical situation right now. So I think things certainly could change, and you never know like what's going to go up and what's going to go down. But right now I do predict a lot of at least current larger groups will look to avoid that type of stuff and avoid less scrutiny. But you just can't discount, a new brash actor stepping in to do something stupid.
Yeah, absolutely. That answer could be very different just in a week's time.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
All right, that is it. So thanks everybody for listening, and happy to take any questions.
Yeah, but thanks, Dave. We appreciate it. I'm not seeing any Q&A come through, but we definitely appreciate you all for joining us for another Cyber Threat Alliance webinar today. Thanks again to Dave and the Cisco Talos team for joining us. If you have any questions, please reach out on our social media. We encourage you to review Talos's blog for additional findings from this work. And they always have good info and posts on other interesting cybersecurity topics for you to check out. So thanks again for joining us. If you're interested in membership in the Cyber Threat Alliance, please go to our website at cyberthreatalliance.org to learn more about us and click contact to reach out to our membership team. We definitely appreciate your time today. If you're a network defender, good luck. There's a crazy environment out there right now. Get some rest when you can. And if you're in the Ukraine, our thoughts are with you, but stay safe. We appreciate it. Take care.
Take care, everybody. Bye.